Welcome. Settle yourself comfortably wherever you are. Let the weight of the day begin to ease from your shoulders. Tonight, we journey back through the mists of time to a world of ancient forests and forgotten voices, to a time when the British Isles and much of Western Europe were home to a people we know as the Celts. You may have heard of the Druids. Perhaps you picture them as mystical figures in flowing white robes, communing with nature, repositories of ancient wisdom and gentle magic. The romantic vision is appealing, soothing even. But tonight we're going to step beyond the legends, beyond the later inventions of poets and occultists, and examine what we actually know about these enigmatic religious figures. And what we discover is something quite different from the fantasy. The reality of Druidic life was demanding, often brutal, and deeply entwined with the harsh realities of Iron Age tribal society. These were not peaceful mystics living in harmony with nature, but powerful political figures navigating a world of constant warfare, human sacrifice, and the endless struggle for survival and influence. So let yourself drift back. Imagine a landscape before cities, before roads, before certainty, a world lit by fire and starlight, a world where knowledge was power, where memory was sacred, and where the price of that power was measured in decades of training, political danger, and duties that would seem horrifying to our modern sensibilities. Take a slow breath. Release the present. We're going back 2,000 years to see what it truly meant to be a Druid. Imagine yourself as a young person in a Celtic tribal society, perhaps somewhere in Gaul or Britain around the 1st century BCE. You are 12, maybe 13 years old. Your family has some standing in the tribe. Perhaps your father is a craftsman of reputation, or your mother comes from a lineage of minor nobility. You've shown aptitude, a good memory, a way with words. The Druids have noticed you. This might seem like an honor. In many ways, it is. The Druids occupy one of the highest stations in Celtic society, alongside the warrior nobility and the skilled bards. They are judges, advisors to kings, keepers of the calendar, and mediators with the gods. To be chosen for this path is to be marked for significance, but understand what this choice actually means for your life. You will spend the next 20 years in training, 20 years, not in a comfortable monastery with regular meals and warm beds, though those don't exist yet in your world anyway. 20 years moving between sacred groves and the houses of established Druids, committing to memory an enormous body of knowledge, because nothing, absolutely nothing of what you must learn is permitted to be written down. The Celts had writing. They knew the Greek and Latin alphabets, used them for commerce and mundane record-keeping. But Druidic knowledge was forbidden to be recorded. This wasn't mere superstition. The oral tradition was sacred, and it was also practical. It created an impossible barrier to entry, ensuring that only those with extraordinary dedication and mental capacity could join the ranks. It made the Druids indispensable. So you would memorize endless verses of poetry, legal precedents stretching back generations, genealogies of noble families, the properties of every plant and tree, the movements of celestial bodies, the proper forms of sacrifice, the intricate web of obligations and debts between tribes, the sacred calendar with its festivals and prohibitions. Thousands upon thousands of verses, stories, laws, rituals. Picture the tedium of it. Day after day, sitting in the dim interior of a roundhouse or beneath the canopy of an oak grove, reciting. Your teacher, an older Druid with decades of knowledge compressed into his memory, speaks a line. You repeat it, again and again. Then the next line, then both lines together, then 10 lines, then 100. The rhythm of the verse is designed to aid memory, but that doesn't make it any less exhausting. There's no rushing this process. You cannot simply pass a test and move on. Each piece of knowledge must be so deeply embedded in your mind that you could recite it perfectly even if woken from deep sleep, even in the chaos of battle, even in old age. The knowledge is not merely learned, it must become part of you, as natural as breathing. And during these 20 years, you are not living a life of contemplation in peaceful isolation. Celtic society is violent. Tribal warfare is constant. Raids, counter-raids, blood feuds between noble families, larger conflicts over territory and resources. The Druids might be exempt from fighting, but they are very much involved in the causes and consequences of war. As a Druid in training, you would witness the preparations for battle, the ritual sacrifices made to ensure victory, the divinations performed to determine auspicious timing. You would see the warriors depart, painted and fierce. You would see some of them return, wounded, triumphant, or shattered. You would see others not return at all. And you would be learning the Druidic role in all of this. Because Druids were not merely spiritual guides. They were judges who settled disputes between nobles, disputes that could easily escalate into violence. They were advisors who counseled kings on matters of war and peace. They were political actors in a complex web of tribal relationships. This brings us to one of the most difficult aspects of Druidic life, the political danger. Druids held immense influence, but this influence made them targets. If a Druid's judgment in a legal dispute favored one noble over another, the losing party might harbor resentment. If a Druid advised a king to pursue a certain course of action, and that action led to disaster, the Druid could be blamed. Celtic society operated on principles of honor and reputation, and a Druid who lost standing could find himself isolated, or worse, in actual physical danger. Moreover, Druids from different tribes could find themselves on opposite sides of conflicts. When your tribe went to war against a neighboring tribe, both sides had Druids performing rituals, offering sacrifices, advising strategy. The Druidic class had some pan-tribal cohesion. They would gather annually at sacred sites in neutral territory. But this didn't prevent them from being deeply embedded in tribal conflicts. There are accounts of Druids being exiled, cast out from their tribes for various offenses or political miscalculations. For a Druid, whose entire identity and 2 decades of training were built around a specific body of knowledge and a specific role in society, exile was devastating. Where would you go? What would you do? Your skills were not transferable to manual labor. You might seek refuge with another tribe, but you'd be an outsider, always suspect, never fully trusted. And then there is the matter of the sacrifices. We must speak plainly about this, because it is central to understanding what Druids actually did. The Celtic peoples practiced human sacrifice. This is not speculation or Roman propaganda. The archaeological evidence is clear. The ancient sources from multiple cultures describe it in detail, and the Druids were the ones who performed these rituals. Imagine that responsibility. The decision of who would be sacrificed often fell to the Druids, based on divination and religious law. Sometimes criminals were chosen, individuals who had committed serious offenses. The Romans tell us that the Celts believed the gods preferred the guilty, that the life of a wrongdoer was more pleasing as an offering. But when criminals were in short supply, the innocent might be chosen. Picture yourself, now fully trained, standing in a sacred grove. The tribe has gathered for a major festival, or perhaps there's a crisis, a plague, a military defeat, a poor harvest that demands appeasement of the gods. You, as the Druid, must select the offering. You must perform the divination, interpret the signs, pronounce the sentence. The methods varied. Some sacrifices were burned alive, enclosed in massive wicker constructions shaped like human figures or animals. Others were drowned in sacred bogs or pools. Some were hanged from sacred trees, offered to gods of the sky and storm. Others still had their throats cut over altars, their blood collected for ritual purposes. You would have to maintain perfect composure through this. The ritual demanded it. You could not flinch, could not hesitate, could not show doubt. You were the intermediary between the human world and the divine. Your certainty, your steady hand, your clear voice chanting the sacred verses, these were essential. Understand, this was not viewed as murder in Celtic society. This was religion. This was duty. This was how the cosmic order was maintained, how the gods were honored, how disaster was averted. But that cultural context doesn't change the visceral reality of what it meant to participate in these rituals, to be responsible for them, to live with them as part of your regular religious practice. And after the sacrifice, the divination would continue. Druids practiced various forms of augury, reading the future in the death throes of the victim, in the pattern of blood, in the arrangement of internal organs. This required close observation of death, an intimate familiarity with the moment when life departed. The psychological weight of this must have been immense, regardless of religious conviction. You would have dreams, surely, memories that surfaced unbidden, the faces of those you selected, the sounds they made, the smell of burned flesh from the wicker man sacrifices, thick and terrible in the air. But you could not speak of these things, could not show weakness. You were a druid. You were the pillar of certainty in an uncertain world. Let's consider also the daily physical realities of druidic life. The romantic vision imagines druids as ethereal beings, somehow above the mundane struggles of Iron Age existence. But you would have lived in the same world as everyone else in your society. A world without modern medicine, without reliable food preservation, without protection from the elements beyond what could be built with wood, thatch, and stone. You would have been cold in winter, damp in the endless rains of Britain and Gaul. Your robes, if indeed you wore distinctive clothing, would have been wool, heavy when wet, never quite dry in the humid climate. Your feet, whether bare or shod in simple leather, would have known the mud, the stones, the cold. The sacred groves where you performed rituals were outdoor spaces. Some ceremonies required presence at dawn or midnight, or other specific times determined by the calendar you had memorized. You would have stood in darkness, in rain, in snow, performing rituals that might last hours, maintaining concentration and perfect recitation regardless of physical discomfort. Food was uncertain. Even in a relatively prosperous tribe, the seasons dictated feast and famine. Late winter was the hungry time, when the stored grain ran low and the spring planting hadn't yet yielded. As a druid, you had status, which meant you ate better than many, but you still lived within the limitations of an agricultural society with no surplus to speak of. Disease was everywhere. The small, crowded roundhouses where tribal peoples lived were ideal breeding grounds for illness. Respiratory infections, intestinal parasites, skin diseases, all common, all inadequately treated. Druids were healers, yes, with knowledge of herbs and treatments, but this knowledge was limited by the understanding of the time. You could brew a willowbark tea for pain and fever, apply poultices to wounds, set broken bones after a fashion. But you could not stop infection, could not cure most diseases, could not prevent the slow attrition of illness that claimed so many lives. You would have seen children die, even in your own family, if you had one, and many druids did marry, did have children. You would likely have buried some of them. Infant mortality was staggering. Perhaps half of all children died before the age of 5. As a healer, as a religious figure, people would look to you for help, for intervention, for explanation. And often you would have nothing to offer but rituals and prayers that might or might not have any effect. The responsibility was crushing. When your remedies failed, when your sacrifices seemed unheard, when your advice led to disaster, the weight of those failures rested on you. And in a society that believed strongly in the power of curses and supernatural retribution, there was always the fear that your own mistakes might call down divine wrath, not just on yourself, but on your entire tribe. Consider too the competition within the Druidic class. These were not gentle scholars cooperating in the pursuit of knowledge. These were ambitious individuals competing for influence, for the favor of kings, for recognition as the most learned, the most powerful. Druids might engage in contests of knowledge, demonstrating their superior memory or rhetorical skill. They might vie for the position of chief druid within a tribe, or for the honor of leading the annual gatherings. This competition could turn bitter. A more skilled druid could eclipse you, could take the positions of influence you had spent 20 years training to occupy. Younger druids, newly trained and eager, might challenge the judgments of their elders. The social dynamics were complicated, fraught with the potential for humiliation or loss of status. And always, there was the matter of belief itself. Did you believe, truly, after decades of performing rituals, making sacrifices, offering prophecies, did the gods answer? Could you see clear evidence of their intervention? Or were you, in the dark hours before dawn, plagued by doubts? The Druids maintained their power partly through genuine religious conviction shared by the society, and partly through the fear and awe they inspired. But surely some Druids must have questioned, must have wondered if the elaborate structure of knowledge and ritual they had devoted their lives to was ultimately built on uncertainty. You could not speak such doubts aloud. To do so would be to undermine everything, your own position, the position of all Druids, the religious foundation of tribal society. So you kept your uncertainties private, locked away, and continued to perform your duties with outward confidence. Picture an older Druid, near the end of his life. He has spent perhaps 60 years embodying this role, 20 in training, 40 in practice. His memory, that prodigious tool that defined his entire career, is beginning to fade. He stumbles over verses he once knew perfectly. He forgets the names of noble ancestors he's recited countless times. He confuses one legal precedent with another. This is disaster. A Druid's authority rests on the accuracy of his knowledge. If he can no longer be relied upon to recite the laws correctly, to preserve the genealogies without error, to perform the rituals in the proper form, what is he? He becomes a liability, an embarrassment. Younger Druids may treat him with ceremonial respect, but they push him aside, taking over his duties, his influence. And what of death itself? The Druids taught the doctrine of the immortality of the soul, its transmigration into other bodies. This was one of their core teachings mentioned by multiple ancient sources. The Celts, we are told, were fearless in battle partly because they believed death was not an ending. But as a Druid, when you felt your own death approaching, did that teaching bring comfort? Or was there, in the final moments, a surge of fear, a desperate hope that the doctrines you'd spent your life teaching were true? The life of a Druid was one of immense responsibility, political danger, psychological weight, and physical hardship, wrapped in a veneer of power and respect. It was a life that demanded everything: your youth, your memory, your certainty, your willingness to perform acts that would haunt you. And in the end, despite all that dedication, all that sacrifice, the Druidic order would be destroyed. The Romans were coming, bringing with them a different way of organizing the world, a different religious system, a different understanding of power. The Druids would resist, of course. They would make their final stand, would face the legions in the sacred groves. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, as you drift towards sleep, imagine that young person who began training at 12, who spent 20 years in memorization, who emerged as a Druid into a world of tribal warfare and human sacrifice, who carried the weight of their people's spiritual life on their shoulders. Imagine the exhaustion, the strain, the moments of doubt hidden behind ritual certainty, the cold mornings in sacred groves, the faces of the sacrificed, the endless verses, repeating in your mind even in dreams. This was the reality behind the mystical legend. This was what it meant to be a Druid. The year is 60 CE, let yourself drift across the Irish Sea to an island the Romans called Mona, and which we know today as Anglesey, off the northwestern coast of Wales. This island is one of the last strongholds of Druidic power in Britain, a sacred sanctuary that has become a refuge for Druids fleeing the Roman advance across the island. For nearly 2 decades, Rome has been consolidating its control over Britain. The invasion began in 43 CE under Emperor Claudius, and since then, the legions have pushed steadily westward and northward, subduing tribes, establishing forts, building roads, imposing order. The British tribes have resisted, sometimes fiercely, but the Roman military machine is relentless, and the Romans have a particular hatred for the Druids. This animosity is not merely religious intolerance, though that plays a part. The Romans view the Druids as the backbone of British resistance, the force that unifies the fractious Celtic tribes in opposition to Rome. When a tribe wavers, considering submission to Roman authority, it is often the Druids who stiffen their resolve, who remind them of their traditions, their gods, their obligations to ancestors. The Druids perform rituals before battle, promising divine favor. They curse the Romans, calling down the wrath of Celtic gods upon the invaders. Moreover, the Romans are genuinely horrified by the practice of human sacrifice. Roman religion had its own brutalities, gladiatorial games and public executions, but human sacrifice had been officially banned in Rome itself for centuries. The Roman writers describe Celtic sacrificial practices with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, using them as evidence that the Celts are barbarians in need of civilizing. So when the Romans conquer a region, they make a point of destroying the sacred groves, cutting down the ancient oaks, defiling the springs and pools where offerings were made, and hunting down the Druids themselves. Some Druids are killed outright. Others are captured and sent to Rome, displayed in triumphs, likely executed in the arena as a demonstration of Rome's power over these foreign priests. Many Druids flee westward ahead of the Roman advance until they reach places like Anglesey. The island has become more than a refuge. It is a symbol, perhaps the last major center of Druidic authority in Roman-controlled Britain. The sacred groves here are ancient, the rituals uninterrupted by Roman interference. The Druids gather here in greater numbers than anywhere else, maintaining their traditions, training new initiates, counseling the tribes that still resist. Anglesey is also wealthy. The island is fertile, capable of supporting a substantial population. It serves as a breadbasket for the tribes of northwestern Wales. Control of Anglesey means control of food supplies for the resistance. This combination, strategic importance and religious significance, makes it an inevitable target. The Roman governor of Britain in 60 CE is Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, experienced military commander with a reputation for ruthlessness. He has been campaigning in Wales, suppressing resistance, and now he turns his attention to Anglesey. He understands that to truly break the spirit of British resistance, he must strike at its spiritual heart. Imagine the preparations. The Roman army assembles on the mainland shore of the Menai Strait, the narrow channel of water separating Anglesey from the Welsh coast. Legionaries in their segmented armor, auxiliary infantry from other conquered provinces, cavalry units, supply trains with food, weapons, timber for construction, engineers assessing the crossing, calculating currents and depths. The Romans build flat-bottomed boats for the infantry, while cavalry prepare to ford the strait at shallower points or swim their horses across. This is a significant amphibious operation requiring coordination and discipline. The legionaries, many of whom cannot swim, must trust that the boats will hold, that they won't be overwhelmed mid-crossing. Now shift your perspective to the island itself. Picture the Druids and the warriors gathered to defend it, arrayed along the shore, watching the Roman preparations across the water. They can see the scale of the force arrayed against them. Thousands of professional soldiers, battle-hardened from campaigns across the empire. The ancient historian Tacitus whose father-in-law Agricola served in Britain and may have participated in this campaign, gives us a description of what the Romans saw as they prepared to cross. He writes of the defenders lined up on the shore, warriors armed with spears and swords, ready to repel the invasion, and among them the Druids. Picture them there, in their ceremonial robes, arms raised toward the sky, calling down curses upon the Romans. The Druid women are there too, present in the battle line, dressed in black, their hair unbound, carrying torches. Tacitus compares them to Furies, the vengeful spirits of Greek mythology. The Druids are performing their function, their duty. They are attempting to protect the sacred island through supernatural means, through the power of their words, their rituals, their connection to the gods. They shout incantations, prayers, curses. The sound carries across the water. The torches wave and smoke in the air. And for a moment, Tacitus tells us, the Romans hesitate. These hardened soldiers, veterans of battles across the empire, pause. The scene before them is alien, disturbing. The wild-haired women with their torches, the chanting priests, the whole tableau of savage religious fervor, it gives them pause. But their commander Suetonius rallies them. He reminds them that they are Roman soldiers, disciplined, rational, superior. He tells them not to fear what are essentially unarmed fanatics. The gods of Rome are stronger than these barbarian deities. The power of the legions is real, tangible, proven in countless battles. What do they have to fear from curses and gestures? The advance begins. The boats push off from shore, oars dipping into the cold water of the strait. The cavalry urges their horses into the current. The crossing is underway. Imagine the desperation of the defenders as they realize the Romans are not turning back, are not cowed by the religious display. The warriors ready their weapons. The Druids intensify their chanting, their voices growing hoarse, more frantic. The women brandish their torches, perhaps hurling them toward the approaching boats. But torches are not weapons of war. Curses, whatever power they might or might not possess, do not stop iron and discipline. The boats reach the shore. Legionaries leap into the shallow water, shields locked, pushing forward. The cavalry emerges from the strait, horses shaking water from their coats, riders drawing swords. The battle, such as it is brief and brutal. The Celtic warriors fight, but they are outnumbered and facing professional soldiers. The shield wall of the legions is an efficient killing machine, swords stabbing out from behind rectangular shields, advancing steadily, leaving fallen defenders in its wake. The Druids themselves cannot fight. Their training has been in memorization, in ritual, in lore, not in warfare. They are physically present in the battle line, but they have no means to defend themselves beyond their religious practices, which are proving ineffective against Roman steel. Picture the moment when the legionaries reach the Druids. These figures who have held such power, such authority in Celtic society, are suddenly helpless before armed soldiers who view them as enemies of Rome. The descriptions we have suggest no mercy was shown. The Druids were cut down where they stood, chanting to the last. The women, too. The torch-bearing women in black, whether they were Druids themselves or wives or attendants, were killed. The Romans saw them as part of the religious apparatus, part of what made this island a center of resistance. They were not spared. Understand the completeness of the slaughter. This was not a battle in the traditional sense, with victors and vanquished, with prisoners taken and ransoms negotiated. This was annihilation, the deliberate destruction of the Druidic presence on Anglesey. The Romans had come specifically to end this center of religious and political resistance, and they were thorough. After the immediate fighting ended, after the bodies lay scattered on the shore, and the Roman standards were planted on Anglesey soil, the systematic destruction began. The soldiers moved inland, searching for the sacred groves. Picture the ancient oak groves, these places that had been sacred for centuries, where generations of Druids had performed rituals, taught initiates, communed with the gods. The trees were old, gnarled, their branches spreading wide, their roots deep in the earth. The ground beneath them was consecrated space, marked by altars, by ritual deposits, by the accumulated spiritual significance of countless ceremonies. The Romans cut down the trees. Axes and saws, the practical tools of military engineers, applied to destruction. The great oaks, which might have stood for hundreds of years, which were themselves viewed as sacred, as dwelling places of spirits, were felled. The sound of the cutting, the crack and crash as the trees came down, must have been terrible to any Celts who witnessed it. The literal destruction of their holy places, of the physical connection between earth and sky that the trees represented. The altars were smashed. The pools and springs where offerings had been made were defiled, perhaps filled with earth or stones, certainly marked as no longer sacred. Any Druidic regalia, sacred objects, the physical apparatus of ritual was taken or destroyed. The Romans understood symbolic warfare. They knew that breaking the power of the Druids required not just killing the individual priests, but destroying the places and objects that gave them authority. Make the sacred profane. Show that the Celtic gods either could not or would not defend their own sanctuaries. Some few Druids may have escaped the initial assault, hidden in the interior of the island, or fled by boat to the more remote reaches of Wales or Ireland. But the island as a functioning Druidic centre was finished. The concentration of religious authority that had gathered there was scattered, broken. And then, in the midst of this victory, news reached Suetonius of disaster elsewhere in Britain. While he had been focused on Anglesey, while the bulk of his forces had been committed to this campaign in the northwest, rebellion had erupted in the east. The Iceni tribe, under their queen Boudica, had risen in revolt, and they had destroyed 3 Roman settlements, including Londinium, modern London. Suetonius had to abandon Anglesey, had to march his legions rapidly across Britain to confront this new threat. The systematic pacification of the island was left incomplete, but the damage had been done. The sacred centre was destroyed, the Druids killed or scattered. The Boudican revolt would ultimately fail, crushed by Roman military discipline in a final battle where tens of thousands of Britons died. And in the aftermath, Roman control over Britain was reasserted, tighter than before. The Druids never recovered as an organized force in Roman Britain. Without their training centers, without their sacred groves, without the critical mass of knowledge keepers necessary to maintain the oral tradition, the institution simply dissolved. Individual Druids likely continued to practice in remote areas, passing on what knowledge they could to a few students, maintaining a shadow of the old traditions. But the political power, the social authority, the unified Druidic class that had been such a feature of Celtic society, that was gone. Imagine being one of the survivors, a Druid who had been elsewhere when Anglesey fell, who returned to find the groves destroyed, the altars broken, the community of fellow Druids scattered or dead. You carry in your memory the verses, the laws, the rituals. But to what purpose? The society that gave those verses meaning is being rapidly transformed by Roman occupation. The kings and nobles you advised are now subject to Roman governors. The legal disputes you judged are increasingly handled by Roman law. The calendar you maintained is being superseded by the Roman calendar. You are a living repository of knowledge that is becoming obsolete, irrelevant. You can still teach someone, perhaps, can pass on the verses to a younger person willing to spend years in memorization. But why would they? What future does this knowledge promise them? The incentive structure that created the Druidic class, the power, the influence, the social status, has been dismantled. So perhaps you settle into a quieter role. You become a healer, focusing on the herbcraft and practical medicine, which still has value. You perform smaller rituals for individuals and families, helping them mark births and deaths, offering blessings. You tell stories about the old days, about the time when Druids advised kings, when the sacred groves were inviolate. But you are increasingly an anachronism, a remnant of a defeated culture. The Romans did eventually ban Druidism explicitly in their territories. The Emperor Tiberius had issued prohibitions earlier in the 1st century CE. Claudius, who launched the invasion of Britain, reinforced these bans. The official position was that Druidic practices, particularly human sacrifice, were incompatible with Roman civilization. But laws are only necessary when something still exists to be banned. By the late 1st century CE, after Anglesey, after decades of Roman occupation and cultural transformation, there was little left of organized Druidism to prohibit. It had been effectively destroyed, not primarily through legal bans, but through military conquest and the deliberate targeting of its sacred centers and practitioners. Let yourself imagine the silence that must have fallen over those destroyed groves, the absence of the chanting, the rituals, the gatherings of robed figures, the oaks, if any remained, standing over broken altars, witnessing the end of the traditions they had sheltered. The knowledge, that vast accumulation of memorized verse, legal precedent, ritual formula, astronomical observation, most of it was lost. Without the unbroken chain of teaching, without the 20-year training period, without the need to memorize everything because writing it was forbidden, the knowledge simply vanished when the individuals who carried it died. We know the Druids existed, we know broadly what they did, but the specifics, the content of their wisdom, the exact words of their chants, the details of their religious cosmology, almost all of that is gone. We have only what Greek and Roman observers recorded, filtered through the understanding and biases of outsiders. We have archaeological evidence of sites and practices, but the Druids' own voice, their own understanding of themselves, is almost entirely silent. Anglesey in 60 CE was the moment when that silence became inevitable. The physical destruction of the sacred center, the killing of the Druids gathered there, the breaking of the chain of knowledge. These were wounds from which the tradition could not recover. As you feel yourself drifting towards sleep, picture that shore, the water of the Menai Strait reflecting the pale northern sky. Picture the broken bodies, the Romans methodically going about the work of conquest and destruction. Picture the smoke rising from fallen timbers, from burned structures. Picture the last Druids dying with curses on their lips or fleeing inland, carrying only what they held in memory. It was an ending, decisive, violent, deliberate. The Romans had identified the Druids as the heart of resistance, and they had cut out that heart. What came after? The slow fading of the tradition in the following decades, the gradual Romanization of Britain, the conversion eventually to Christianity, all of that was in some sense inevitable after Anglesey. The mystical figures of legend had faced the reality of empire, and they had lost. The sacred groves fell to axes. The memorized knowledge died with its keepers. The oak trees came down, one by one, until the sacred groves were groves no longer, just clearings in the forest, marked only by stumps and silence. Let that silence wash over you now. The ancient voice is gone. The rituals ended. The long history of the Celtic priesthood brought to a close on a shore in Wales as Roman soldiers cleaned their swords and prepared to march east to face the next crisis. Let yourself drift forward now, away from the battlefield, away from the immediate violence of conquest. We move into a different kind of discovery, a different way of encountering the ancient past. We're going to explore one of the most haunting archaeological mysteries connected to the Celtic world and its religious practices, the phenomenon of the bog bodies. Imagine a peat bog. If you've never seen one, picture a landscape that is neither quite land nor quite water. The ground is spongy, uncertain beneath your feet. Dark water pools in depressions, reflecting the sky. Peat moss grows thick and dense, accumulating layer upon layer over centuries. The air smells of earth and decay, but decay arrested, slowed to an almost geological pace. These wetland environments exist throughout northern Europe. In Ireland, Britain, the Netherlands, Denmark, northern Germany, they've been there for thousands of years, accumulating organic matter, preserving it in the acidic, oxygen-poor conditions, and occasionally, over the centuries, human beings have ended up in these bogs. Sometimes by accident, a traveler stepping off a path, sinking into deep water, unable to escape. But sometimes, deliberately. The discovery of these bodies is often startling, accidental. A farmer cutting peat for fuel in the 18th or 19th or 20th century, working methodically through the layered earth, suddenly strikes something that is clearly not peat. Leather, perhaps, hair, and then, with growing horror, the realization that this is human remains. A body, preserved by the bog, emerging from the peat after centuries or even millennia. The preservation can be remarkable, uncanny. The bog's chemistry, the acidity, the tannins from the peat, the absence of oxygen, works to preserve soft tissue in a way that normal burial does not. Skin survives, turned brown and leathery by the bog water, but intact. Hair remains, sometimes with its original color visible. Fingerprints are still present, the whorls and loops clear enough to be recorded. Internal organs, though compressed and altered, can still be examined. The contents of stomachs can be analyzed, revealing final meals. But the bog gives, and it also takes. The acid that preserves flesh dissolves bone, so these bodies emerge oddly flattened, their skeletal structure largely gone, leaving something that looks almost like a leather sculpture of a human being compressed by the weight of the peat. Let's consider some specific examples, some of the most famous and well-studied bog bodies, and what they reveal about Celtic ritual practice. Begin with Lindow Man, discovered in 1984 in a peat bog at Lindow Moss in Cheshire, England. Workers at a peat-cutting operation found the body, and initially there was confusion. Was this a recent murder victim? The police were called. But radiocarbon dating eventually established that the remains were from the 1st century CE, the Roman period in Britain. Picture the examination of Lindow Man's remains. The body was that of a young man, perhaps in his mid-20s, well-nourished, with manicured fingernails suggesting he didn't engage in heavy manual labor. Not a peasant then, someone of some status. And then the violence becomes apparent. Lindow Man died hard. The back of his skull was fractured by at least 2 blows from a heavy object, an axe perhaps, or a club. His neck showed signs of a ligature, a cord that had been tightened around his throat, garroting him, and his throat had been cut, a deep incision that severed the jugular vein. 3 methods of death. Overkill, from a purely practical standpoint. If you simply wanted someone dead, one method would suffice. But this was not practical murder. This was ritual. The stomach contents were analyzed. Lindow Man's final meal had been a piece of unleavened bread, made from wheat and barley, burned slightly. Pollen analysis revealed that the bread contained traces of mistletoe pollen. Mistletoe, the sacred plant of the Druids, the plant that grew on oak trees and was harvested with golden sickles in ceremonial rituals described by Roman sources. So we have a high-status young man eating ritual bread containing mistletoe, killed by 3 different methods, and deliberately placed in a bog. This is not random violence. This is sacrifice. The theory that has developed around Lindow Man and similar bog bodies is that they represent a specific form of Celtic religious practice, threefold death offerings to multiple deities, the blow to the head for one god, strangulation for another, the cut throat for a third, or perhaps the 3 methods represent earth, water, and sky, the fundamental divisions of the Celtic cosmos, each receiving its due. The placement in the bog itself is significant. Bogs were liminal spaces in Celtic belief, boundaries between the mortal world and the other world. Water has always held religious significance in Celtic culture. Sacred wells, ritual pools, offerings thrown into lakes and rivers. The bog, neither land nor water, alive with strange plants and prone to mysterious sounds and movements, must have seemed particularly charged with spiritual power. Now shift your attention to Denmark, to Tollund Man, discovered in 1950. The preservation here is extraordinary. When the body was first uncovered, the finders thought they had discovered a recent murder victim. The face is peaceful, almost serene, the eyes closed, the lips slightly parted. The skin is dark brown from the tannins, but the features are clear, individual, human. You can see the stubble on his chin, the lines around his eyes. This person, dead for over 2,000 years, is immediately recognizable as a human being, as someone who once lived and breathed and thought. Tollund Man wore a pointed skin cap and a leather belt. He was naked otherwise, and around his neck was a braided leather noose, drawn tight, still there after more than 2 millennia. He had been hanged, or perhaps garroted. The distinction becomes technical. The noose had compressed his neck, stopping the flow of blood to his brain, cutting off air. Death would have come within minutes, perhaps with convulsions, certainly with the knowledge of what was happening. His last meal, a porridge made from grains and seeds of various kinds, some of which were known to have narcotic or psychoactive properties. Was he drugged before his death? Given something to make him compliant, or perhaps to induce a trance state? A connection to the divine in his final moments. Like Lindow Man, Tollund Man showed no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds on his hands or arms. This suggests, though it cannot prove, that he went to his death willingly, or at least without fighting. Perhaps he was unconscious from the drugged porridge, or perhaps he was a willing victim, someone who believed that his death served a greater purpose, who had been prepared for this role through ritual and religious indoctrination. Consider what it would mean to be a willing sacrifice. You would have been raised in a culture that accepted human sacrifice as necessary, as holy. You might have witnessed sacrifices yourself at festivals, seen how the community honored the victims, how the Druids spoke of their deaths as sacred, as ensuring the favor of the gods and the prosperity of the tribe. Perhaps you were chosen because of some distinction. You were born under auspicious signs, or you had survived a close brush with death and were considered already touched by the other world, or you came from a family with a history of providing sacrificial victims. Perhaps it was considered an honor, a way to ensure your immortality, not just in the afterlife that the Druids taught, but in the memory of your people. You would have been prepared, ritually purified, perhaps for days or weeks. Special foods, prayers, instruction from the Druids about what would happen, about the significance of your death. The final meal, carefully prepared, containing the sacred grains and seeds, then the walk to the bog, the community perhaps following, witnessing, the Druids chanting, the moment when the noose is placed around your neck, when you kneel or stand as directed, when the tightening begins. How much of this was willing, truly, and how much was coercion dressed in religious language, cultural pressure so intense that resistance was literally unthinkable? We cannot know. The bog bodies cannot tell us their thoughts, their fears, whether they went to death with genuine religious conviction or with silent, unexpressed terror. What we do know is that this practice was widespread. Bog bodies have been found across northern Europe, dating from the Bronze Age through the Roman period. Hundreds of discoveries, though many were not recognized as ancient remains when first found, and were simply reburied or discarded. Of those that have been properly studied, a significant number show signs of violent death. The threefold death: hanging, throat-cutting, blunt force trauma to the head. Not all bog bodies are sacrifices. Some appear to be accidental deaths, people who lost their way in the treacherous terrain. Some may be executed criminals, disposed of in the bog as a form of dishonor. Some might even be murder victims, their deaths having nothing to do with religion. But the ritual victims are distinct. They show patterns, the manner of death, the final meal, the evidence of high status, the careful placement in the bog. These are not bodies hastily hidden. These are deliberate depositions, religious acts performed according to traditional protocols. Let's consider the gender dynamics. While many bog bodies are male, there are female victims as well. Wide Girl, found in the Netherlands, was about 16 years old when she died, sometime in the 1st century CE. She had been hanged and then stabbed in the chest. Her blonde hair was partially shaved on one side, and she had severe scoliosis, a curvature of the spine that would have given her a pronounced deformity. Was she chosen because of her physical difference? In many cultures, people with unusual physical characteristics are considered touched by the divine, set apart, perhaps more suitable as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. Or was her deformity seen as inauspicious, and her death was meant to remove bad luck from the community? We are guessing, interpreting, trying to reconstruct beliefs and practices from fragmentary evidence. This is the frustration and the fascination of archaeology. We have the bodies, we can analyze their last meals and their manner of death, but we cannot fully access the meaning that these deaths held for the people who performed the rituals. Think about the moment of deposition in the bog. The body has been killed according to ritual specifications. Now it must be placed in the water. This is not a burial in the traditional sense. The body is not being laid to rest with the expectation that it will remain undisturbed, perhaps with grave goods to accompany it to the afterlife. Instead, the body is being given to the bog, to the liminal space between worlds. Perhaps there's a belief that the bog will convey the victim to the other world, that the sacrifice will be received directly by the deities of water and earth. Or perhaps the bog itself is the destination, the dwelling place of spirits that must be appeased with offerings of human life. The bodies often show signs of being pinned or weighted down, stakes driven through limbs, heavy stones placed on the torso. This suggests a fear that the body might rise, might walk, might return. The concept of the restless dead is ancient and widespread. A sacrificial victim, someone who died violently, might be particularly likely to become a troublesome spirit if not properly secured. So the body is not merely placed in the bog, it is pinned there, held down, kept in place by physical force even after death. This adds another layer of strangeness to the ritual. The victim's death is sacred, necessary, honored, but also feared. The body must be prevented from returning. Imagine the Druids and the assembled community standing at the edge of the bog in the dim northern light. The body has been prepared, killed, and now must be committed to the water. They wade into the bog, feeling the cold water and soft peat, carrying the body with them. They push it beneath the surface, arrange the limbs, perhaps bind them with cords or stakes. They speak the final words, the prayers or formulas that complete the ritual. And then they withdraw, leaving the body to the bog, to the slow process of preservation that they could not have anticipated, that has allowed us, 2,000 years later, to recover these remains and puzzle over their meaning. The bog bodies raise uncomfortable questions about Celtic society and Druidic practice. The romanticized vision of Druids as wise nature priests living in harmony with the land does not accommodate human sacrifice very easily. We prefer our ancient cultures to be either barbaric, and thus justifying their conquest and replacement, or noble and enlightened, and thus tragic in their loss. The reality is more complex and more disturbing. The Celts were capable of sophisticated artistry, complex social organization, eloquent speech and philosophical thought about the nature of existence and death. And they also practiced human sacrifice, sometimes on a significant scale, as part of their religious system. Both things are true. Both must be held in mind when we try to understand this culture. The Druids, as the religious authorities, were the architects and executioners of this system. They selected the victims, performed the necessary divinations, carried out the ritual killings, and disposed of the bodies. This was part of their duty, part of what it meant to mediate between the human and divine worlds. And then, after the Roman conquest, after the destruction of the Druidic order, the sacrifices stopped. Or at least, they were no longer performed openly, were no longer part of the official religious life of the communities. The bogs still received occasional bodies over the following centuries, but the pattern of ritual killing that characterizes the Iron Age bog bodies disappears from the archaeological record. This is evidence for the central role of the Druids in organizing and legitimizing the practice. Without them, without their authority, and their claim to understand what the gods required, human sacrifice could not be sustained. The practice required a religious infrastructure to support it, to select victims, to perform complex rituals, to maintain the communal belief that these deaths were necessary and holy. When Rome destroyed that infrastructure, when the Druids were killed or scattered, when the sacred groves were cut down, the religious system that included human sacrifice collapsed. The people who had once watched these rituals, who had perhaps contributed victims from their own families, moved on. They adopted Roman religious practices, and later Christianity, neither of which included human sacrifice in their official forms. The bodies remained in the bogs, slowly becoming part of the peat forgotten. Centuries passed. The memory of the rituals faded. The locations were lost. The bogs continued their slow accumulation, layer upon layer, until eventually, sometimes 1,000 years later, sometimes 2,000, a blade cutting peat encountered leather and hair, and the past emerged, preserved and strange, demanding interpretation. As you drift towards sleep, think about the quietness of the bogs now. The peat is still harvested in some places, though less than before. The bodies, when discovered, are taken to museums, studied with modern scientific techniques, displayed behind glass for visitors to contemplate. They have become objects of historical curiosity, data points in the reconstruction of ancient religious practices. But once, they were people. The young man with manicured nails eating his last meal of mistletoe-laced bread. The teenager with scoliosis, perhaps frightened, perhaps resigned, feeling the rope around her neck. The man whose face is so perfectly preserved that we can still see his individual features, his humanity. They died for reasons we can only partially understand. As part of rituals we can reconstruct only in outline. Their deaths were meant to mean something, to appease gods, to ensure harvests, to maintain cosmic order. Whether those deaths actually accomplished anything beyond the psychological assurance they provided to the living community is unknowable. What remains is the mystery, the bodies themselves, impossible to look at without wondering what they thought, what they felt, whether they believed in the purpose of their deaths. The bogs that preserved them, dark and quiet, holding their secrets for millennia. The fragments of ritual practice we can piece together from archaeological evidence and ancient texts, never quite complete enough to fully understand. Let that mystery settle over you now. The unanswered questions, the faces from the past, the bog water slowly turning them into something between human and artifact. The cold preservation, the acid and the peat, the long centuries of darkness before discovery. Sleep now if you can. The bog bodies rest in their museum cases, far from the water that kept them intact. The bogs themselves remain, patient, perhaps still holding discoveries that have not yet emerged into light. The past is always there, just beneath the surface, waiting. Let yourself drift back now to the living world of the Druids, before the destruction, before the endings. We're going to explore the places where Druidic power was most fully expressed. The sacred groves, the ritual sites, the locations where Druids advised kings and shaped the laws that governed Celtic tribal life. Begin with the oak tree itself. In the Celtic languages, the word for oak and the word for druid are connected. The Old Irish word for oak is dare, and druid may derive from roots meaning oak knowledge or oak seer. Whether this etymology is certain or not, the association between druids and oak trees is consistent across our sources. Picture an oak grove in ancient Britain or Gaul. These are not the neat, managed woodlands we might imagine today, with clear paths and controlled undergrowth. These are old-growth forests, places where human intervention has been minimal or non-existent. The oaks themselves are ancient, some perhaps 300 or 400 years old, with massive trunks, spreading canopies, branches that twist and reach in complex patterns. The ground beneath these trees is dim, even in daylight, the dense foliage above filtering the sun into scattered patches of light. The air smells of earth, of decomposing leaves, of the slightly sharp scent of oak bark and acorns. In the dampness of the British climate, moss grows thick on the tree trunks and ferns cluster in the shadows. The sound is of wind moving through leaves, of birds calling, of small animals moving through underbrush, and occasionally of water, a stream running through the grove or a pool among the roots. These groves were chosen or designated as sacred spaces. Perhaps a particular grove had been used for ritual purposes for generations, the sanctity accumulating through repeated use. Perhaps there was something distinctive about the location, an unusual tree formation, a natural clearing, the presence of a spring. Perhaps there had been a significant event there, a vision, a miracle, a moment when the divine seemed particularly present. Whatever the origin, once a grove was established as sacred, it became a center of Druidic activity. This was where initiates were trained, sitting in circles beneath the trees, reciting verses, listening to the elder Druids expound on lore and tradition. This was where the major seasonal festivals were celebrated, the community gathering to witness rituals and sacrifices. This was where kings came to consult with Druids on matters of war and peace, of succession and alliance. The groves were not merely neutral meeting places, they were charged with religious significance, and this significance translated into political power. A king who ignored Druidic advice given in the sacred grove was not merely making a political miscalculation, he was risking divine displeasure, supernatural consequences. The setting mattered. The words spoken under the ancient oaks carried more weight than the same words spoken in a roundhouse or a field. Let's imagine a specific scene. A tribal king needs to make a decision about whether to go to war with a neighboring tribe over a disputed territory. This is not a decision to be made lightly. War means death, disruption of agriculture, the risk of defeat and its consequences. But honor is also at stake, and tribal prestige, and the loyalty of the warrior class who expect their king to be bold. The king travels to the sacred grove, accompanied by his retinue, senior warriors, perhaps some noble advisors. They arrive at dawn, the traditional time for important consultations. The grove is already occupied by druids, perhaps several of them, dressed in their ceremonial robes. The atmosphere is formal, ritualized. The king states his case, describing the dispute, the provocations from the neighboring tribe, the pressure from his own warriors to respond with force. The druids listen, impassive. They may ask questions, probing the details, the history of relations with the other tribe, the king's true motivations. Then the druids confer among themselves, possibly withdrawing deeper into the grove for private discussion. The king and his retinue wait, perhaps for hours. The sun rises higher, filtering through the oak leaves. The waiting is part of the process, a demonstration that the druids are not simply telling the king what he wants to hear, that they are genuinely consulting their knowledge, their understanding of the laws and the will of the gods. Finally, the druids return with their judgment. Perhaps they advise against war, citing legal precedents, suggesting alternative means of resolving the dispute, warning of inauspicious omens. Or perhaps they support the war effort, but with conditions. Certain rituals must be performed, certain offerings made, certain protocols followed. The king must take this advice seriously. To ignore it is to risk not just the Druids' displeasure, but the disapproval of the gods they represent. Other nobles will know that the king consulted the Druids and then disregarded their counsel, and this will be remembered, will affect the king's reputation and authority. This is how the Druids exercised political power. They did not command armies, did not hold territorial authority in the way kings did. But they shaped decisions through their control of religious knowledge, through their claim to understand the cosmic order and the requirements of the gods. The sacred grove was the physical space where this power was most visible, most formally expressed. The groves also served as neutral territory for intertribal gatherings. Celtic society was fractious, tribes constantly jockeying for position, old feuds and alliances creating a complex political landscape. But the sacred groves, particularly the major ones, were recognized as inviolate spaces where violence was prohibited. Once a year, we are told, Druids from across a region would gather at a central sacred site. For Gaul, this was a location in the territory of the Carnutes tribe, considered the center of the Celtic world. Here, Druids would meet to discuss matters of common concern, to settle disputes among themselves, to elect a chief Druid who would have authority over the others for the coming year. Picture this gathering, Druids traveling from distant tribes, journeying for days or weeks to reach the sacred site. They arrive to find others already there, Druids they may know from previous years or strangers from tribes they've only heard of. There's competition here, certainly, rivalry over knowledge, over reputation, over influence. But there's also a shared identity, a recognition that despite tribal differences, the Druids are a class apart, united by their training and their role. The gathering itself would be part conference, part ritual observance, part political maneuvering, discussions of legal precedents, debates over interpretations of traditional knowledge, contests of memory where Druids demonstrate their mastery of the verses, ritual sacrifices performed collectively with senior Druids taking the leading roles, and the politics, which Druid should be recognized as chief, which tribes' concerns should take precedence, how to respond to external threats like Roman expansion. These gatherings were crucial for maintaining some level of cohesion across the fractious Celtic tribal landscape. They allowed for the transmission of knowledge, for the standardization of legal practices, for the creation of a pan-tribal Druidic identity that transcended individual tribal loyalties. But they also highlighted the limitations of Druidic power. The Druids could advise, could judge, could perform rituals, but they could not force tribes to cooperate, could not prevent wars, could not create political unity. When the Romans invaded, the Celtic tribes did not present a united front. Some tribes allied with Rome, seeing advantage in doing so. Others fought, but without coordinating their resistance. The Druids, for all their influence, could not overcome the fundamental political fragmentation of Celtic society. Now let's shift our attention to the physical traces these sacred sites have left in the archaeological record. This is frustratingly sparse. Unlike Roman temples or Christian churches, which were built of durable stone and left clear structural remains, the Celtic sacred groves were, by definition, natural spaces. The sanctity was in the trees and the earth, not in human-built structures. Archaeological excavations at sites identified as possible sacred groves have found evidence of ritual activity, deposits of offerings, animal bones from sacrifices, fragments of metalwork deliberately broken or bent before being buried. But the groves themselves, the actual circles of trees, have left no direct trace. Trees grow and die, forests change, and 2,000 years is more than enough time for any particular grove to have disappeared, cut down deliberately by Romans or Christians, or simply succumbing to natural processes. Some ritual sites were marked by wooden posts or structures. Excavations have found post holes arranged in circular patterns, evidence of timber circles or other wooden architecture. These structures may have been associated with Druidic rituals, though we cannot be certain. They might have served as markers defining sacred space, or as supports for ceremonial structures, or even as astronomical observation posts. The Druids were credited with knowledge of the movements of celestial bodies, and such knowledge would have required systematic observation and recording. Water sources within or near sacred groves held particular significance. Springs, in particular, were considered sacred, points where water emerged from the earth, where the boundary between the surface world and what lay beneath was permeable. Many Celtic sacred sites are associated with springs or wells, and these continued to be venerated even after Christianization, often being rededicated to Christian saints, but retaining their basic character as holy water sources. Ritual deposits in water are among the most consistent archaeological signatures of Celtic religious practice. Lakes, rivers, and bogs have yielded thousands of offerings. Weapons, jewelry, tools, cauldrons, even entire chariots, deliberately deposited in water as gifts to the gods. The scale of this practice is remarkable. At some sites, enough weapons have been recovered to equip a small army, all of them bent or broken before being thrown into the water, rendered useless for human purposes, transformed into sacred offerings. This practice continued in some areas even after Roman conquest and Christianization, though the meaning may have evolved. The impulse to mark significant places with offerings, to acknowledge the sacred through material sacrifice, persisted across religious transformations. You can still see echoes of it today in the coins thrown into fountains and wells, a vestigial memory of ancient practices. Let's consider what it meant to encounter these sacred sites as an ordinary person in Celtic society, not a druid, but perhaps a farmer or craftsperson. The groves would have been places of awe, certainly, but also of apprehension. The sacred is not always comforting. It can be dangerous, overwhelming, something to be approached with caution and proper ritual preparation. You might visit a sacred grove only on festival days, as part of the larger community, when druids were present to mediate the encounter with the divine. Or you might approach seeking healing, or an answer to a pressing question, bringing an offering and hoping for intercession. But you would not wander casually into a sacred grove. These were set-apart places, and to violate their sanctity through improper behavior, through violence, through pollution, could bring divine retribution not just on yourself, but on your entire community. The atmosphere in these groves during rituals must have been intense. Imagine a nighttime ceremony, the darkness held back by torches and fires, the druids in their robes, faces shadowed, voices chanting in rhythms and words that the average person might only partially understand. The druids used an elevated, archaic form of language for their rituals, full of ancient vocabulary and complex poetic structures. The community gathered, witnessing but not participating directly, feeling the weight of the sacred, the presence of powers beyond human control. And if a sacrifice was to be performed, imagine the tension, the solemnity, the victim being brought forward, the druids speaking the ritual formulas, the moment of death, the interpretation of the signs. This was the most serious business of the community, the maintenance of right relations with the divine, the ensuring of continued blessings, and the avoidance of supernatural disaster. The groves were also where the druids taught their initiates, where the 20-year process of memorization took place. Picture groups of younger people sitting beneath the oaks, their teachers pacing before them, reciting verses, requiring repetition. The grove itself became a mnemonic device, this tree where you learned the laws of inheritance, that clearing where you memorized the genealogies, that spring where you studied the properties of plants. The physical landscape and the knowledge became intertwined, each reinforcing the other. When the Romans destroyed these groves, they were not merely cutting down trees. They were destroying the entire infrastructure of Druidic knowledge transmission. The places where memory was built, where knowledge was embedded in landscape, were being deliberately erased. The Druids who survived had their mental libraries intact, but the physical sites that had supported the creation of those libraries were gone. Consider also the class dynamics visible in these sacred spaces. The groves were where the Druids interacted most directly with the tribal elite, kings, nobles, senior warriors. Ordinary tribal members might attend major festivals, might witness certain rituals, but they did not have the same level of access. The private consultations, the high-level legal judgments, the political discussions, these were reserved for those with status. The Druids, in mediating between the human and divine, also mediated between different levels of human society. They provided a source of authority separate from military power or inherited nobility. A Druid came from a free family, but did not need to be of the highest nobility. Their status was earned through decades of training, through demonstrated mastery of the traditional knowledge. This gave them a certain independence, a standing that was based on expertise rather than birth or martial prowess. But this also meant they were invested in maintaining the social order that gave them this status. The Druids were not revolutionaries seeking to overturn tribal hierarchies. They were part of the elite, benefiting from the existing system, using their religious authority to reinforce the structures of tribal kingship and noble privilege. The laws they memorized and adjudicated were largely concerned with property, inheritance, obligations between nobles, compensation for injuries based on social rank. These were laws that reflected and perpetuated inequality. So the sacred groves, for all their spiritual significance, were also sites where social hierarchy was performed and reinforced. The king consulted the Druids, demonstrating his piety and the legitimacy of his rule. The Druids advised the king, demonstrating their indispensability and maintaining their privileged position. The nobles witnessed these interactions, their own status confirmed by their proximity to sacred power, and the common people watched from a greater distance, included in communal rituals, but excluded from the inner workings of power. As Roman control tightened over Britain and Gaul, as the sacred groves were destroyed or fell into disuse, these spaces lost their function. Without the Druids to maintain them, without the rituals that had defined them as sacred, they reverted to being simply groves of trees, patches of forest like any other. Some were cut down for timber or to clear land for agriculture. Others remained but lost their meaning, the memory of their sanctity fading within a generation or two. Christianity, when it arrived, sometimes appropriated these sites, building churches near or on top of ancient sacred spaces, Christianizing the landscape as Rome had desanctified it. Other times, the sites were simply avoided, their pagan associations making them uncomfortable, suspect. Local people might remember that a particular grove had once been sacred, might tell stories about strange happenings there, might avoid it after dark. But the specific religious practices, the Druidic rituals, were forgotten. What remains now, 2 millennia later, are fragments, place names that hint at ancient sanctity, locations with oak in their names, or references to springs and groves, archaeological sites with their ritual deposits and post holes, their arrangements that suggest structured religious activity, and the accounts in classical texts, descriptions by Greek and Roman writers who witnessed or heard about Druidic practices in sacred groves. From these fragments, we try to reconstruct what these places meant, how they functioned, what it felt like to stand beneath those ancient oaks and participate in rituals connecting the community to forces beyond human understanding. But it's like trying to understand a symphony from a handful of notation fragments and written descriptions by people who didn't particularly like that style of music. We can approximate, can build theories, but the lived experience, the full sensory and emotional reality, is beyond our reach. Let yourself imagine those groves one more time, The dim light filtering through oak leaves, the smell of earth and growing things, the voices of druids chanting verses in the ancient language, rhythmic and sonorous, the community gathered, silent, attentive. The smoke from ritual fires rising into the canopy, the sense of being in a place set apart, where the ordinary rules were suspended, where contact with the divine was possible, where the fate of individuals and communities was negotiated with powers that could grant blessing or disaster. These places existed. The Druids spoke their verses under these trees. Kings sought counsel here. Sacrifices were performed, blood spilled on roots and earth. Young initiates committed thousands of verses to memory in these shaded spaces. The oaks witnessed it all, silent and enduring until the axes came. And now the groves are gone, or transformed beyond recognition. The knowledge spoken beneath them is mostly lost. The Druids who walked these paths are long dead, their memories dissolved into time. What remains is the echo, the archaeological trace, the attempt at reconstruction. Rest now in that quiet. The ancient voices have fallen silent. The sacred groves have been cut down or forgotten. The oak trees, if any still stand from that era, do not remember what they witnessed. The past recedes, becomes uncertain, becomes legend and mystery. Imagine yourself standing on a dock in Venice during the 16th century. Perhaps in the year 1565. The morning mist is lifting from the lagoon, and before you stretches a vessel unlike any you've seen in modern times. Long and low in the water, perhaps 150 feet from stem to stern, but narrow. So narrow that 30 feet at its widest point seems almost impossibly slender for such length. This is a galley, the warship and merchant vessel that built Venice's maritime empire. And tonight, we'll explore what life was truly like aboard these remarkable, terrible ships. The galley's design had changed remarkably little since ancient times. While the great sailing ships of the Atlantic were evolving rapidly during this period, the Mediterranean galley remained faithful to principles established by Greek and Roman shipwrights centuries before. There were good reasons for this conservatism, reasons rooted in the unique conditions of the Mediterranean Sea itself. Its calm summers, its island-dotted geography, its relatively predictable weather patterns that made oar power more reliable than wind. But the human cost of this efficiency was staggering. For every merchant who grew wealthy from galley trade, for every nobleman who commanded a fleet, for every sailor who volunteered for the promise of wages, there were dozens more who had no choice in the matter. Men chained to benches, reduced to the status of living machinery, their bodies the engines that propelled Venice's ambitions across the waves. Tonight, we'll experience their world in 4 parts. First, we'll step aboard a galley and understand the daily reality of the men who rowed, the physical conditions, the social hierarchies, the small rituals that marked the passage of days that all felt the same. Then we'll witness one of history's greatest naval confrontations, the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where 200 galleys on each side clashed in what would be the last great galley battle in European history. After that, we'll descend beneath the waves to explore what modern archaeology has revealed about these vessels and the men who crewed them, piecing together fragments of lives long ended. Finally, we'll climb from the rowing benches to the elevated stern cabins where merchants and nobles traveled in relative luxury, examining the profound divide between those who labored and those who profited. The story of the galley is, in many ways, the story of Venice itself, a republic built on trade, maintained by force, and powered by the exploitation of human bodies. It's a story of ingenuity and cruelty, of beauty and suffering existing side by side on vessels that were simultaneously marvels of engineering and instruments of torment. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. Tonight, we travel not across pleasant waters, but across the great central sea of the medieval and early modern world, aboard the ships that made Venice wealthy beyond measure, at the cost of countless anonymous lives. Let us begin by understanding the galley itself, for the vessel shaped every aspect of the lives lived aboard it. Picture yourself approaching one of these ships as it sits in harbour. The first thing that strikes you is the smell, an overpowering combination of tar and salt water, unwashed bodies and bilge water, the acrid scent of urine, and the sweetish rot of provisions going bad in the heat. You notice this before you even step aboard, and you will never entirely grow accustomed to it. The galley is built for one purpose above all others: to maximize the number of oars that can be pulled while keeping the vessel light enough to be propelled by human muscle alone. Everything else, the comfort of the crew, the storage of provisions, even the defensive capabilities of the ship, is secondary to this fundamental requirement. A typical Venetian galley of the mid-16th century might have 25 rowing benches on each side, arranged in a configuration that had recently undergone a significant evolution. For centuries, galleys had used a system called alla sensile, where each oar was pulled by a single rower, with oars arranged in groups of 3 at slightly different heights. But by the early 1500s, Venetian shipwrights had developed a new system called a scalocchio, where each bench held multiple men, typically 3 to 5, all pulling on a single enormous oar. This innovation allowed for longer oars and thus greater leverage, making the galley more efficient. But it also meant that the men were packed even more tightly together, their bodies pressed against each other as they worked, their individual identities subsumed into the collective effort of the bench. Imagine yourself then taking your place on one of these benches. If you are fortunate, and we use that word advisedly, you are a buonavoglia, a free oarsman who has volunteered for this work in exchange for wages. Such men did exist, though their numbers declined steadily throughout the 16th century, as Venice increasingly relied on forced labor. You might be a poor fisherman from the lagoon villages, a man with debts to pay or a family to feed, choosing this hard life because the alternatives were somehow worse. Or perhaps you're a young man seeking adventure, not yet understanding what you've consented to. More likely, however, you belong to one of the other categories of rowers. You might be a condannato, a condemned criminal sentenced to the galleys instead of prison or execution. Venetian courts were remarkably liberal in their application of galley service as punishment. Petty theft, vagrancy, smuggling, or debt might all result in a sentence of 5, 10, or even 20 years at the oar. Some men who began their sentences as young criminals would row until they were grey-haired, their bodies twisted by decades of repetitive labor, their crimes long forgotten by everyone except themselves. Or perhaps you are a slave, purchased specifically for galley service. Venice was a Christian republic and officially frowned upon the enslavement of fellow Christians, but this scruple was easily circumvented. Slaves might be taken in naval actions against Ottoman vessels, or purchased from markets in the Eastern Mediterranean, or even kidnapped from coastal villages during raids. By the mid-16th century, a significant proportion of galley rowers were slaves, their legal status reducing them to property bought and sold with the ships themselves. Regardless of your status, your physical position aboard the ship is essentially the same. You sit on a wooden bench approximately 4 feet wide and perhaps 18 inches deep, angled slightly forward. The bench is not smooth but rough wood, splinters inevitable, the surface darkened by years of sweat and the oils of countless bodies. There is no cushioning, no padding. If you are among the innermost rowers on the bench, the position closest to the center of the ship, you are slightly more protected from the elements, but also more trapped, with other bodies between you and any possibility of movement. The oar you will pull is a massive thing, perhaps 30 feet long, with the majority of its length extending outward from the ship over the water. The inner portion, the loom, is where you and your benchmates will grip it, And even this supposedly manageable section is a heavy timber that requires the coordinated effort of all the men on your bench. The oar passes through an opening in the ship's side, not a formal oar port as in ancient galleys, but rather over an outrigger, a frame that extends beyond the hull to provide the necessary leverage. Chained to your bench, for even free rowers were often chained during battle or in dangerous waters, and slaves and convicts were chained always. You have perhaps 4 feet of chain, enough to allow you to move from sitting to standing position as the rowing motion requires, but no more. The shackle is riveted around your ankle, the metal worn smooth by constant motion, but still capable of raising sores wherever it touches skin. Some men wrap their ankles in rags to prevent chafing. Others endure the open wounds that never quite heal, wounds that weep and crust and weep again with every stroke of the oar. Let us walk through a typical day aboard a galley, understanding the rhythm that structured these men's lives. The ship is most often in motion during daylight hours, for galleys rarely risked night sailing except in emergencies or when the moon was full and the weather clear. The Mediterranean, for all its relative predictability, could turn treacherous quickly, and a galley sitting low in the water was vulnerable to swamping even in moderate seas. The day begins before dawn. You have spent the night in the same position you occupied during the previous day's rowing, sitting on your bench, or perhaps slumped against the man beside you in uneasy sleep. There is nowhere else to go. The galley has no lower decks where rowers might sleep, no hammocks strung in dark holds. You sleep where you work, your body never free from the constraint of the chain, your rest broken by the constant small movements of the ship, by the cries of other men caught in nightmares, by the cough that seems to afflict every crew after a few weeks at sea. As light breaks, the call comes to prepare for rowing. The aguzino, the overseer or boatswain who commands the rowers, walks the central gangway that runs between the benches, striking his staff against the deck, rousing any who have managed to sleep deeply enough to require waking. He is often a man who has himself rowed, promoted to this position either as reward for service or as relief from injury. He knows every trick the rowers might attempt to ease their labor, knows when men are malingering and when they are genuinely spent. Some aguzini are harsh but fair. Others seem to delight in cruelty, as if their elevation from the benches has made them eager to demonstrate their authority over those who remain below. Before rowing begins, there is the matter of food. Breakfast, such as it is, consists of hardtack, ship's biscuit, twice baked to drive out moisture, as hard as wood and often moving with weevils. You've learned to tap your biscuit against the bench before eating, dislodging the larger insects, then eating in the dim light before dawn, so you cannot see what else might be sharing your meal. With this comes a ration of wine, heavily watered, sour and thin. It's barely alcohol, more a way of making the ship's water, which quickly grows stale and algae green in its barrels, palatable enough to drink. Some men receive slightly better rations. Free rowers, when they existed in larger numbers, might get cheese or olives, a bit of salted fish. But slaves and convicts receive only the minimum necessary to keep them capable of work. Ship captains calculated carefully, too little food, and the rowers weakened, unable to generate the power needed to drive the ship. Too much food and the expense cut into profits. Men were kept in a state of perpetual hunger, their bodies consuming themselves slowly, muscle turning stringy, faces becoming gaunt, the prominent bones of elbows and collarbones pressing against skin. Then the rowing begins. The ship is most often making passage from one port to another, following the coastline, for galleys rarely made open water crossings, preferring to keep land in sight where possible, ready to run for shore if weather threatened. The rowing is coordinated by different methods depending on the urgency. For normal cruising pace, a steady, sustainable rhythm is established. A man might call out the stroke, or a drum or whistle might sound the beat. The motion becomes automatic after the first few days. Rise from your seated position, lean forward, grip the oar, pull back as you sit, pushing with your legs, pulling with your back and arms, the oar blade biting the water, resisting, the weight enormous, requiring all the strength of your bench to move it. And then again and again, hour after hour, the sun climbing higher, the heat beginning to press down. The Mediterranean sun in summer is merciless, and you are entirely exposed to it. Some ships provide a canvas awning over the rowing benches, but many do not. And even where such coverings exist, they are often left furled to avoid interfering with combat readiness. Your skin darkens rapidly, burns and peels and burns again, until it becomes leathery and weathered, creased with premature aging. Men who row for years develop a particular appearance: hunched shoulders, overdeveloped backs and arms, legs that have atrophied somewhat from disuse, faces aged far beyond their years. The motion of rowing is both numbing and exhausting. It's monotonous, the same movement repeated thousands of times a day, but it's also intensely physical, demanding constant effort. There is no rest while the ship is underway, except during brief pauses when the crew is fed, or when the captain orders a halt to take soundings or to consult with other vessels in a fleet. Your hands develop calluses so thick they seem barely human, areas of skin so hardened they've lost all sensitivity. But between the calluses, in the creases of your palms and fingers, the skin cracks and bleeds, the salt water working into these fissures, stinging constantly. Around midday, there is usually a pause. The heat is simply too intense for sustained rowing, the danger of heat stroke too great even for the most profit-minded captain to ignore. Men slump over their oars, chests heaving, sweat pouring from their bodies in quantities that seem impossible. Some men pour seawater over themselves for relief, though this provides only momentary cooling and leaves salt crystals that make the chafing worse. The midday meal is much like breakfast: more hardtack, more watered wine, perhaps a piece of onion or a handful of beans boiled into mush. Then, as the worst heat passes, rowing resumes. The afternoon session often continues until sunset, the light gradually softening, the temperature finally becoming bearable. When darkness falls, the galley typically anchors if a suitable harbour or beach is available, or else simply puts out a sea anchor and drifts, the crew finally able to rest. But rest is not the same as comfort. You remain chained to your bench. There is no privacy, no dignity. All bodily functions must be performed where you sit. Galleys have no toilet facilities for rowers, at most a hole cut in the side of the ship near each bench, or simply the space between the ship and the sea. Men urinate and defecate where they are, trying to aim overboard when possible, but often, especially in rough seas or during battle, simply fouling themselves and their benchmates. The constant dampness, the lack of hygiene, the tight quarters, all of this creates perfect conditions for disease. Infections are common. Small wounds, a blister, a splinter, a scrape from the chains, can rapidly become inflamed and dangerous in the filthy conditions. Men develop boils and abscesses that must either be lanced by the ship's surgeon, if one exists and is willing to treat rowers, or left to rupture on their own. Fevers sweep through the crew with terrifying regularity. Typhus, dysentery, scurvy on longer voyages. These diseases kill as surely as battle, and more slowly, men wasting away on the benches, still chained, still expected to row until they physically cannot. The response to sickness is often brutal in its pragmatism. A man who cannot row is not merely useless, but actively burdensome, consuming rations that might better go to those still capable of work. Slaves and convicts who fall too ill to recover are sometimes simply thrown overboard, still chained, their bodies committed to the sea without ceremony or record. Free rowers might receive slightly better treatment, but not much. The calculation is always the same. Can this man work again? If not, why continue to feed him? Let us consider now the social world of the rowing benches, for even in these harsh conditions, hierarchies and relationships developed. The bench becomes a small community unto itself. You and your benchmates, perhaps 4 other men, are bound together by more than chains. Your survival depends on your coordination. If one man on the bench fails to pull his weight, literally, the others must compensate, working harder to move the massive ore. This creates pressure to perform even when exhausted, even when sick. For to fail is to burden your benchmates, and their resentment can make an already miserable existence even worse. Some benches develop a grim camaraderie. Men share what little they have, a piece of food saved from rations, a scrap of cloth to wrap a wounded hand, whispered conversations that make the hours pass more bearably. They learn each other's stories, their crimes or misfortunes, their families left behind. Some men have been rowing together for years, their fates intertwined, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization, born of endless repetition. Other benches are sites of constant tension and conflict. Men from different backgrounds, Venetians and foreigners, Christians and Muslims, free men and slaves, might find themselves chained side by side, their hatreds and suspicions having nowhere to dissipate in the forced intimacy of the bench. Fights break out despite the chains, despite the certain punishment. The aguzzino must sometimes separate men, reassigning them to different benches, breaking up feuds before they poison morale or interfere with rowing efficiency. The officers and sailors who man the galley, not the rowers but the free crewmen who handle the sails, manage the rigging, fight in battle, occupy a completely different world despite living on the same small vessel. They can move about the ship. They sleep under the partial shelter of the quarterdeck or in the small forecastle. They eat better food. They are not chained. They look upon the rowers with a mixture of pity and contempt, seeing them as something less than fully human, a necessary evil living tools. The social distance between rowers and free crew is maintained carefully, for there were sometimes more rowers than free crew on a galley, and the possibility of uprising was a constant underlying fear. Slaves and convicts greatly outnumbering the sailors could theoretically overwhelm them if they were ever to act in concert. But the chains made coordination difficult. The ever-present threat of the whip and worse punishments suppressed thoughts of rebellion. And perhaps most effectively, many rowers harbored no great love for their benchmates and no desire to risk their lives for the benefit of men they might despise. Yet uprisings did occur, rare but dramatic. When they succeeded, and they rarely did, the rowers might attempt to sail the galley to freedom, though few had the navigational skills to accomplish this. More often, rebellions were crushed with savage efficiency, the ringleaders executed in ways calculated to terrorize others into compliance. Hanging, flogging to death, being thrown overboard, weighted with chains, these fates awaited those who challenged the order of the ship. The whip was a constant presence, a tool of motivation and punishment. The aguzzino carried one always, and its use was casual and frequent. A man who missed a stroke might receive a lash. A man who complained might receive 10. The whip left permanent scars, layered welts across backs and shoulders, tissue that had been torn and healed and torn again so many times it barely resembled normal skin. Some men bore these scars with a kind of pride, evidence of their endurance. Others wore them as marks of shame, visible proof of their degradation. In rough weather, the misery intensified beyond imagination. A galley in a storm was a nightmare of terror and confusion. The low-riding vessel shipped water constantly, waves breaking over the sides, flooding the rowing positions. Men sat in water up to their waists, unable to leave their benches, unable to seek shelter. The water was bitterly cold, sapping body heat, and the constant motion of the ship, pitching, rolling, sometimes beam on to waves that threatened to capsize the vessel, made even sitting a challenge, men clinging to their oars, to their benches, to each other, terrified of being thrown overboard while still chained, knowing such a fate meant certain drowning. The noise was overwhelming. The shriek of wind, the crash of waves, the groaning of the galley's timbers under strain, the shouts of officers barely audible over the chaos. Men prayed to their various gods, Christian and Muslim voices rising together in a babel of desperate entreaty. Some men simply screamed, terror overcoming all other considerations. And through it all, if the officers deemed it necessary, rowing continued, men pulling at oars they could barely see through the sheets of rain and spray. Their movements now more a matter of muscle memory than conscious effort. When storms finally passed, the galley was a scene of utter exhaustion. Men slumped over their oars, too tired even to speak. Some had died during the storm, drowned despite being aboard ship, or succumbed to the cold, or simply given out, their hearts stopping from pure exhaustion. Their bodies were removed from the benches, sometimes with difficulty, rigor mortis having set in while they were still shackled, and committed to the sea. New rowers would take their places at the next port, the cycle continuing, an endless supply of desperate or condemned men always available to replace those lost. Imagine the psychological toll of this existence. You wake to chains, you work in chains, you eat, sleep, eliminate in chains, your entire world circumscribed by perhaps 4 feet of movement. You can see the sea all around you, vast and open, but you cannot reach it except as your death awaits in its depths. Time loses meaning. Days blur together, distinguished only by subtle changes in weather or routine. Weeks become months. Months become years for long-term convicts and slaves. Some men endured by fragmenting their consciousness, finding ways to absent themselves mentally from their physical circumstances. They retreated into memory, replaying better times over and over, or into fantasy, imagining elaborate scenarios of freedom and revenge. They recited prayers or poems, the familiar words a kind of lifeline to sanity. Some men simply went numb, their responses to pain and hardship muted by sheer psychological exhaustion, their eyes becoming distant and unfocused, present in body, but increasingly absent in mind. Others maintained their sense of self through small rituals and acts of defiance. They might save a fragment of food, not to eat later, but simply to prove they could deny the immediate impulse, could exert some tiny measure of control over their circumstances. They might give names to the seabirds that followed the galleys, creating narratives about these creatures' lives. They might mark the passage of time by scratching lines into wood or counting in their heads, refusing to let time become an undifferentiated blur. The mortality rate among galley rowers was staggering, though exact figures are difficult to establish because records were poorly kept, especially for slaves and convicts. But estimates suggest that perhaps 1 in 4 rowers died each year, their places constantly needing to be filled. A man sentenced to 10 years at the oar might easily see dozens of benchmates come and go, their deaths so routine they barely registered as events worth noting. And yet, life persisted in the spaces between suffering. Men fell in love, brief and often brutal affairs between rowers and the occasional woman who found her way aboard ship, a prostitute in harbour, a captured passenger, even sometimes the wife or daughter of an officer, the power dynamics always fraught and dangerous. Children were even occasionally born aboard galleys, though they rarely survived the conditions. Letters were written by those few who were literate, messages scratched on scraps of wood or cloth, passed through chains of intermediaries in hopes of reaching distant families, though most such messages never arrived. There were moments, brief, rare but real, of something approaching joy. A particularly beautiful sunset might draw appreciative murmurs from the benches. A school of dolphins playing in the bow wave would be watched with pleasure by men who had forgotten how to smile. A fair wind allowing the sails to be raised, giving the rowers a rest, brought relief so intense it was almost painful in itself, the cessation of agony creating its own disorientation. A swig of decent wine, obtained by barter or theft, might be savoured with an intensity no free man could understand, the taste an explosion of flavour to palates accustomed to monotony. Some men completed their sentences, survived their years of rowing and were released, their chains struck off, their freedom restored. These men often bore the marks of their service permanently. Their bodies were bent, their health broken, their years stolen. They returned to cities and villages where they were no longer quite at home, where they could not explain to those who had not rowed what it had been like, where the rhythms of ordinary life seemed strange after the rigid routine of the galley. Some such men managed to rebuild lives, finding work, marrying, aging into a premature elderliness. Others struggled, turned to drink or crime, sometimes ending up back on the galleys, the cycle closing cruelly. And through it all, through the suffering and the death, through the storms and the heat, through the monotony and the terror, the galleys rowed on. They carried the trade goods that made Venice wealthy. They patrolled the shipping lanes, protecting Venetian interests. They fought in battles that shaped the balance of power across the Mediterranean. They were, in their way, marvels of efficiency, machines for converting human suffering into forward motion. And they persisted for centuries because they worked, because they served their purpose, because the men who commanded them and profited from them could look upon the rows of chained rowers and see not human tragedy, but simply the necessary cost of maritime dominion. The sun sets over the water, the light fading to purple and then to black. The galley has anchored for the night in a small cove, the water relatively calm, the stars beginning to appear overhead. You sit on your bench, your day's work done, your body aching in ways that have become so familiar they're almost beneath notice. Around you, other rowers settle into their uneasy rest, some talking quietly, others already asleep despite the hardness of the bench, despite the chains, despite everything. Tomorrow will be the same, and the day after, and the day after that. This is life on a Venetian galley. This is the price paid by thousands of anonymous men, and this is the foundation upon which a great maritime power was built. Let your breathing slow. Let this world of wooden benches and salt water, of chains and exhaustion, begin to drift away. We've established the baseline, the daily reality, the grinding routine that shaped these men's lives. When you're ready, we'll continue our journey into deeper waters, toward the moment when these suffering, struggling crews would be tested in the fury of history's last great galley battle. Let us move forward now through time and space, from the generic experience of galley life to a specific moment, a particular day when thousands of these vessels and tens of thousands of these rowers converged in the waters of the Gulf of Patras, off the coast of Greece, in what would become the most significant naval engagement of the 16th century. The date is October 7th, 1571, and the battle that unfolds will be remembered as Lepanto, a name that would echo through European consciousness for generations. To understand Lepanto, we must first step back and consider the broader context, the slow-building tensions that made this confrontation inevitable. The Mediterranean in the mid-16th century was divided between two great powers: the Ottoman Empire, vast and expanding, confident in its military superiority, and Christendom, though this term conceals the fractious, often mutually hostile states of Catholic Europe, temporarily unified by their common fear of Ottoman expansion. The Ottomans had been pressing westward for decades. Constantinople had fallen in 1453, extinguishing the last remnant of the Byzantine Empire. The Balkans were firmly under Ottoman control. Hungary had been devastated by Ottoman campaigns. The sieges of Vienna, particularly the Great Siege of 1529, had sent shockwaves through Europe, raising the terrifying prospect that the Ottomans might push into the very heart of the continent. But it was at sea, in the Mediterranean, that Ottoman power seemed most overwhelming. The Ottoman fleet was enormous, well organized, and commanded by leaders who had learned their craft through decades of almost continuous warfare. The arsenal at Constantinople could build galleys at astonishing speed. Some accounts suggest a new galley could be completed every day during periods of intensive mobilization. The Ottoman system of supplying rowers was similarly efficient. The empire's vast territories provided an essentially endless supply of prisoners, slaves, and impressed subjects who could be chained to the benches. Venice, by contrast, was in many ways a power in decline, though still formidable. The discovery of new trade routes around Africa to Asia had diminished the importance of the Mediterranean as a commercial highway. Venice's mainland territories in Italy, while valuable, were vulnerable to attack from rival Italian states and from the Habsburg Empire. The city's wealth, though still considerable, was no longer growing at the explosive rates of earlier centuries. And perhaps most concerning, Venice was increasingly struggling to crew its galleys. The pool of volunteers willing to row had diminished, forcing greater reliance on convicts and slaves, and even these sources were becoming strained. The immediate cause of the confrontation that led to Lepanto was Cyprus. This island, the third largest in the Mediterranean, had been under Venetian control since 1489. It was valuable for its strategic location, its agricultural production, and its symbolic importance as a Christian outpost in the eastern Mediterranean. But in 1570, the Ottoman Sultan Selim II demanded its surrender. When Venice refused, an Ottoman army invaded, beginning a campaign that would prove catastrophic for the island's defenders. The siege of Famagusta, Cyprus's principal fortress, would last for nearly a year, one of the most brutal sieges of the century. The Venetian garrison, commanded by Marcantonio Bragadin, held out with extraordinary determination against overwhelming odds, but by August 1571, with supplies exhausted and no relief forthcoming, surrender became inevitable. What followed was a violation of the terms of surrender that shocked even contemporaries accustomed to wartime atrocities. Bragadin was tortured and then flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw and displayed as a trophy. This act of savagery galvanized Christian Europe in a way that diplomacy alone could never have accomplished. Pope Pius V, a Dominican friar who had risen to the papacy, had been working for years to create a Holy League, a coalition of Catholic powers that could confront the Ottoman threat. The fall of Cyprus and the martyrdom of Bragadin finally overcame the mutual suspicions and rivalries that had previously prevented effective cooperation. Spain, under Philip II, agreed to contribute ships and men. Venice, despite its earlier preference for negotiation, now committed its fleet. The Papal States offered money and ships. Various smaller Italian states added their contingents. Even the Knights of Malta, that warrior order that had famously held their island fortress against Ottoman siege in 1565, sent galleys to join the fleet. Command of this coalition fleet was given to Don Juan of Austria, the illegitimate son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and thus half-brother to King Philip II of Spain. Juan was only 24 years old in 1571, young for such responsibility, but he had already distinguished himself in military campaigns and possessed the diplomatic skills necessary to manage the egos and competing interests of the various contingents under his command. He was also genuinely committed to the enterprise, seeing it not merely as a military operation, but as a crusade, a holy war to defend Christendom. The fleet that gathered under Don Juan's command in the summer of 1571 was staggering in its size. Contemporary accounts vary, but the Christian force included approximately 210 galleys and 6 galleasses, these last being a Venetian innovation, essentially reinforced galleys carrying much heavier artillery. Aboard these vessels were perhaps 13,000 sailors and 30,000 soldiers, along with approximately 43,000 rowers. most of them convicts, slaves, or pressed men. The rowers, as always, would fight as well, though whether their participation would be voluntary or coerced remained to be seen. The Ottoman fleet, commanded by Ali Pasha, was of comparable size, approximately 230 galleys and a number of smaller vessels, carrying perhaps 13,000 sailors and 34,000 soldiers, with rowing complements similar to the Christian side. The two forces were thus remarkably balanced, neither enjoying the overwhelming numerical superiority that might guarantee victory. The fleets maneuvered through September, searching for each other in the Ionian Sea, neither commander initially eager for a decisive engagement. Galley warfare, for all its drama, was risky. A battle could devastate a fleet, and replacing galleys while possible was expensive and time-consuming. Both sides preferred to achieve their objectives through blockade, raid, and the capture of vulnerable targets, rather than through direct confrontation. But circumstances were pushing them toward battle. For the Christian fleet, there was pressure to achieve something tangible. The coalition was fragile, held together more by fear than by genuine unity of purpose. A campaign that accomplished nothing would likely be the last such coalition for years to come. For the Ottomans, there was the confidence born of decades of victory, a belief that the Christian fleet could be crushed if brought to battle, and that such a victory would open the entire Western Mediterranean to Ottoman dominance. On the morning of October 7th, the two fleets sighted each other in the Gulf of Patras, also known as the Gulf of Lepanto. The Gulf's geography favored neither side particularly, though it did prevent either fleet from easily withdrawing once engaged. The morning was calm, the waters relatively flat. Good conditions for galley warfare, where rough seas would make maneuvering difficult and risk swamping the low-riding vessels. Imagine yourself now, not as a single rower on a single bench, but as a consciousness floating above this scene, able to perceive the vast scale of what is about to unfold. Two great lines of galleys, extending for miles across the mouth of the Gulf, begin to move toward each other. The Christians have formed their line with the Spanish galleys in the center under Don Juan's personal command, the Venetian and Papal galleys on the left wing, and Genoese and Allied galleys on the right. The 6 massive galleasses have been positioned forward of the main line, intended to break up the Ottoman formation with their heavy guns before the main engagement begins. The Ottoman line is similarly arranged, with Ali Pasha commanding the center, facing Don Juan directly. The Ottoman wings extend to north and south, seeking to envelop the Christian line if possible. Both fleets fly countless banners and pennants, the colorful silk whipping in the breeze, the visual splendor contrasting strangely with the grim purpose of the day. Drums beat aboard the galleys, maintaining rowing tempo, the sound carrying across the water. Priests and imams move among the soldiers, offering prayers and blessings, invoking divine favor for the coming slaughter. Now let us descend from this aerial perspective and place ourselves aboard a specific galley, let us say a Venetian vessel in the left wing of the Christian fleet, part of the squadron commanded by Agostino Barbarigo. You are a rower, chained as always to your bench, but today is different from every day you have experienced before. You have rowed in storm and calm, through tedious passages between ports, but you have never rowed into battle on this scale. The atmosphere aboard the galley is tense and strange. The soldiers, professional fighters from various parts of Europe, volunteers motivated by faith or plunder or adventure, are checking their weapons, donning armor, gathering in the fighting spaces at bow and stern. The ship's guns, relatively small cannon mounted on the bow, are being loaded and prepared. Officers move about with exaggerated calm, projecting confidence they may not feel. And among the rowers, there is a mixture of fear and something else, anticipation perhaps, or hope. For you see, before battle, certain decisions must be made about the rowers. Slaves and convicts kept in chains during normal operations represent a vulnerability during combat. A galley that takes serious damage might sink quickly, and chained men cannot escape. Moreover, men who feel they have no stake in the outcome of the battle might not fight effectively, and in galley warfare, the rowers were often armed and expected to participate in combat once the vessels closed with each other. Some captains kept their rowers chained, even in battle, prioritizing control over combat effectiveness. But others, including many of the Christian commanders at Lepanto, made a different choice. The call goes out aboard your galley. The chains are to be struck. You feel the shackle around your ankle being opened for the first time in months, or perhaps years, depending on your sentence. The metal falls away, and the sudden lightness is disorienting. Your ankle, freed from the weight, feels strange, and you realize you've become so accustomed to the chain that its absence is almost troubling. Around you, other rowers are experiencing the same liberation, some rubbing their ankles, others simply sitting in stunned silence. The captain addresses the rowers, his voice carrying across the benches. The speech varies from ship to ship, but the content is similar. Today, you fight for Christendom against the enemies of the faith. Fight well, and there may be clemency, rewards, even freedom. Run or hide, and the consequences will be severe. Death or re-enslavement, or return to the galleys under harsher conditions. But mostly, fight well because your life depends on it. These Ottoman galleys carry men who will show you no mercy, who will slaughter you where you sit if the battle goes against the Christians. Weapons are distributed, not to everyone, but to those judged most reliable. Perhaps you receive a pike, a long wooden shaft topped with a metal point, useful for thrusting at boarders, for resisting attempts to grapple your ship. Or perhaps a cutlass, a short, broad-bladed sword, practical in the confined spaces of ship-to-ship fighting. Some rowers receive nothing, deemed too untrustworthy even in these desperate circumstances. The two fleets continue their approach. The distance closes from miles to hundreds of yards. You can now see the individual Ottoman galleys clearly, their crescent banners brilliant against the sky, their hulls painted in bright colors, their crews visible as masses of men. The sound builds, the drumbeat intensifying, horns and trumpets adding their voices, and underlying it all, the splash of thousands of oars, the breathing of thousands of men, the creak and groan of timber and rope. The Christian galleasses open fire first. These heavy vessels, positioned forward, carry artillery more powerful than anything on the standard galleys. The guns boom, smoke billowing, and across the water you can see the effect. Ottoman galleys struck, holes smashed in their sides, masts toppling, oars splintering. The Ottoman line wavers, some galleys pulling back, others swerving to avoid the concentrated fire. The plan is working. The galleasses are disrupting the Ottoman formation before the main engagement begins. But the Ottomans are experienced warriors, and they adapt quickly. The Ottoman galleys begin to stream around the galleasses, avoiding direct approaches, seeking to engage the main Christian line. And now, suddenly, the distance has closed to mere yards, and individual combats begin erupting all along the line. Your galley is making for an Ottoman vessel, both ships rowing hard, each trying to strike the other at an angle that will give advantage. The goal in galley warfare is to ram, to drive your reinforced bow into the enemy's side, smashing oars, holing the hull, creating chaos among the enemy rowers while your own soldiers pour across onto their deck. A successful ram can decide the fight before it truly begins, leaving the enemy crippled and vulnerable. The two galleys collide with enormous force. The impact throws you forward. You catch yourself against the bench in front of you, barely avoiding being thrown to the deck. The sound is tremendous. Splintering wood, the screams of men caught between ship and ship, the grinding of hull against hull. Your galley has struck a glancing blow. Not the perfect ram that would have crushed the Ottoman vessel's side, but enough to lock the two ships together, their oars entangled, their bows overlapping. And now the real horror begins. The soldiers from both ships surge forward, meeting at the bows, where the vessels overlap, fighting hand to hand in a space barely 20 feet wide. Arquebuses fire, These early muskets, inaccurate but devastating at close range, belching smoke and lead shot. Crossbows loose their bolts. Arrows arc across the narrow gap between ships. Men thrust with pikes, swing with swords, grapple and stab and bludgeon. The noise is overwhelming. Shouts, screams, the clash of metal on metal, the splintering of wood, the explosion of gunpowder weapons. You and your fellow rowers are now in an impossible position. The fighting is happening above and around you, but you are still in the rowing benches, unable to reach the combat directly, yet entirely exposed to its dangers. Arrows and shot meant for the soldiers fall among the rowers as well, indiscriminate in their distribution of death. A man 2 benches ahead of you takes an arrow in the throat. You see him claw at it, blood pouring between his fingers, his eyes wide with shock and terror. Another rower is struck by flying debris, a chunk of broken oar or mast, and collapses across his bench. Some rowers are climbing out of the benches now, joining the fight, or simply seeking any position less exposed than the open rowing deck. Those who have weapons move forward, adding their numbers to the soldiers. Those without weapons cower behind the benches, or try to move to the stern of the ship, or simply remain where they are, frozen by fear or confusion. The Ottoman galley has its own soldiers, and they are fighting with equal desperation. You catch glimpses of them across the tangled bows, men in turbans and flowing robes, wielding curved scimitars, firing their own arquebuses. They are no less skilled, no less determined than the Christian fighters. The battle on your small section of the Gulf is entirely even, neither side gaining clear advantage. Minutes pass, though they feel like hours, and the fighting continues with undiminished intensity. Bodies are falling into the narrow space between the locked galleys, disappearing into the water. The decks of both ships are becoming slippery with blood, making footing treacherous. Men slip and fall, and those who fall are often finished by opponents who take advantage of their vulnerability. Your galley's guns fire again, but at this range, locked together with the enemy. The effect is as dangerous to your own men as to the enemy. The shot tears through both ships, smashing into the crowded fighters, killing Christians and Ottomans alike. The tactic is desperate, brutal, trying to kill enough of the enemy to break their resistance, accepting your own casualties as the price. Around you, across the Gulf, hundreds of similar combats are unfolding. Each locked pair of galleys becomes its own miniature battle, its own distinct story of struggle and death. The larger pattern of the battle is impossible to perceive from your limited vantage point. You cannot know that the Christian right wing, under Gianandrea Doria, is being hard-pressed, gradually forced back by superior Ottoman numbers. You cannot know that in the center, Don Juan's galley and Ali Pasha's galley have collided directly, locked in combat that will eventually decide the day. You cannot know that on the left wing, where your galley fights, Barbarigo has been struck in the eye by an arrow and will die of the wound, though his squadron fights on. What you can perceive is that slowly, painfully, your galley is gaining the upper hand in its particular combat. The Ottoman soldiers are being pushed back, their numbers dwindling. Some are retreating toward their galley's stern. Others are diving into the water, choosing to take their chances with the sea rather than with Christian steel. Your ship's soldiers press forward, fighting their way onto the enemy deck, and now the Ottoman rowers, most of them Christian slaves, you realize, are faced with a terrible choice. Some of these men, enslaved by the Ottomans, seeing Christian fighters approach, throw down any weapons they might have held, raise their hands in surrender, call out in Greek or Italian or Spanish, proclaiming their faith, begging for mercy. Others, whether out of loyalty to their Ottoman masters or simply confusion and fear, continue to resist. The fighting becomes even more confused, Christian soldiers trying to distinguish between Ottoman fighters and enslaved Christians, often failing to make such distinctions in the chaos. Your galley's victory over its immediate opponent is replicated across much of the Christian line. The galleasses have done their work, disrupting the Ottoman formation. The slight advantage in artillery that the Christian fleet enjoys, more and heavier guns per ship on average, is telling. And perhaps most importantly, the wind, which has been calm all morning, suddenly picks up, blowing from the west, from behind the Christian fleet. The Christians can raise their sails, gaining additional speed, while the Ottomans, facing into the wind, cannot. These small advantages accumulate. Ottoman galleys, engaged by Christian ships that have the momentum of wind and current behind them, find themselves overwhelmed. The Christian soldiers, many of them veterans of land warfare in Italy or the Low Countries, prove slightly more effective in the close quarters combat than their Ottoman counterparts. Or perhaps it is simply luck, the random distribution of skill and courage happening to favor the Christians on this particular day. The center of the Ottoman line begins to collapse. Don Juan's galley, along with several others, has overwhelmed Ali Pasha's flagship. The Ottoman commander is killed. Accounts vary on exactly how, some claiming he was beheaded, others that he was shot. But the result is the same: the death of the overall commander, the loss of the flagship, a psychological blow from which the Ottoman fleet never recovers. The Ottoman banner is struck, replaced by a Christian standard, and the visual signal of this reversal spreads across the battlefield, disheartening Ottoman fighters, encouraging Christian ones. The Ottoman wings, seeing the center crumbling, begin to withdraw. Some galleys break off combat and attempt to row away toward the eastern end of the Gulf. Others, too closely engaged to escape, fight on with increasing desperation. The battle, which has been balanced and chaotic, suddenly tips decisively. What was a battle becomes a rout, with Christian galleys pursuing fleeing Ottoman vessels, running them down, capturing them or destroying them. The slaughter intensifies. Galleys that attempt to surrender are sometimes given quarter, their crews taken prisoner. But more often, in the heat of pursuit, Christian soldiers show little mercy. Ottoman crews are massacred, thrown overboard, or left aboard galleys that are then set alight. The water of the Gulf becomes choked with debris, broken oars, pieces of hull, bodies, so many bodies, thousands of men who will never return home. By late afternoon, the battle is effectively over. The Christian victory is total, more complete than even the most optimistic Christian commanders had hoped. Of the approximately 230 Ottoman galleys that entered the battle, perhaps 130 have been captured and 50 more destroyed or sunk. Only 40 or so Ottoman vessels successfully escape. Ottoman casualties are staggering, perhaps 30,000 men killed and another 8,000 captured. Christian losses, while significant, are far lower, perhaps 7,500 dead and 8,000 wounded. But these numbers, vast as they are, do not capture the full scope of the day's transformation. Let us return to you, aboard your Venetian galley, as the fighting ends and the magnitude of what has occurred begins to become clear. Your ship has survived relatively intact. Damaged, certainly, with dead and wounded men being attended to, with repairs needed, but still afloat, still functional. Around you, the Gulf is filled with Christian galleys, many towing captured Ottoman vessels, others still hunting down fleeing enemies. And among the captured galleys, a discovery is being made, one that will become central to the mythology of Lepanto. The Christian slaves who had been rowing Ottoman galleys, perhaps 15,000 men in total, are being freed. Their chains are being struck off, just as yours were before the battle. But for them, the liberation is permanent, not tactical. These men, some of whom have rowed for years under Ottoman masters, are weeping, embracing their liberators, giving thanks to God for their deliverance. You watch this scene with complicated emotions. You are happy for these freed men, certainly, but you are also aware that your own chains, removed this morning, will likely be restored. You are still a convict or still a slave, depending on your status. The battle has been won, but your sentence has not been commuted. Some promises were made before the fighting, hints of freedom, of clemency. But whether these will be honored remains uncertain. In the event, some rowers who fought at Lepanto were indeed freed, or had their sentences reduced. The most famous example is Miguel de Cervantes, the future author of Don Quixote, who fought at Lepanto as a soldier and was wounded in the battle, losing the use of his left hand. But Cervantes was a free volunteer, not a galley slave. For actual rowers, convicts and slaves, the outcomes were more variable. Some Venetian convicts received clemency, some Spanish slaves were freed. But many, perhaps most, found themselves returned to the benches, their service in battle acknowledged with slightly better rations or minor reductions in sentence, but not with the freedom they had hoped for. The immediate aftermath of the battle was chaos. Ships needed to be repaired, wounded men needed treatment, supplies needed to be gathered. The Christian fleet anchored in the Gulf for several days, sorting through the captured Ottoman vessels, deciding which could be salvaged and incorporated into the Christian fleets and which were too damaged to be worth the effort. Bodies had to be dealt with, thousands of them, floating in the water or lying on the decks of ships. Mass burials at sea were conducted, both Christians and Ottomans committed to the depths, though the Christians received prayers and the Ottomans often did not. News of the victory spread rapidly across Europe, carried by fast vessels dispatched immediately after the battle. The reaction was euphoric. Church bells rang in Rome, in Venice, in Madrid, in cities across Catholic Europe. Processions and celebrations were organized. Pope Pius V, who had worked so tirelessly to create the Holy League, proclaimed the victory a miracle, attributing it to the intercession of the Virgin Mary. The battle had been fought on the feast of Our Lady of the Rosary, and this coincidence was taken as proof of divine favor. The propaganda value of Lepanto was immense. For decades, the Ottoman fleet had seemed invincible, an unstoppable force that won battle after battle, that struck fear into Christian coastal populations, that captured islands and fortresses seemingly at will. Lepanto shattered this perception. It demonstrated that the Ottomans could be beaten, that Christian unity could achieve what divided Christian states could not. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the military impact. And yet, in the longer term, Lepanto changed less than its contemporaries hoped or feared. The Ottoman Empire, for all its losses at Lepanto, remained a formidable power. Within a year, the Ottoman arsenal had rebuilt the fleet, launching new galleys at extraordinary speed, replacing the losses. The balance of power in the Mediterranean shifted, but not dramatically. Cyprus remained in Ottoman hands. The victory at Lepanto came too late to save the island. Venice, exhausted by the cost of the war, soon made peace with the Ottomans, accepting the loss of Cyprus in exchange for resuming trade relations. The Holy League, that fragile coalition that had achieved such a remarkable victory, quickly dissolved. Spain became increasingly focused on the revolt in the Netherlands and on its Atlantic interests. Venice returned to its traditional pragmatism, preferring profitable trade to expensive warfare. The Papal States lacked the military power to continue the war alone. Within a few years, it was as if Lepanto had never happened, at least in terms of practical Mediterranean politics. But in the realm of culture and memory, Lepanto endured. The battle became a touchstone, a reference point, invoked whenever people spoke about the conflict between Christianity and Islam, about naval warfare, about the possibility of unity among divided peoples. Paintings, poems, histories celebrated the victory. Veterans of Lepanto, like Cervantes, carried the memory throughout their lives, shaping their identities and their art. For the men who rode at Lepanto, the battle was a day unlike any other in their lives, a day when they were briefly more than chained laborers, when they participated in something larger than their own suffering, when they were actors in a historical drama rather than victims of historical circumstance. Some of them would tell the story of that day for the rest of their lives, to anyone who would listen, embellishing perhaps, but also remembering with precision certain details: the sound of the Ottoman drums, the color of the sky, the face of the man who fell beside them, the weight of the pike in their hands, the moment when the Ottoman line broke and they knew finally that they had won. Others would never speak of it, would lock the memory away, finding it too painful or too complicated to revisit. They had killed men that day, or watched men die, or been wounded themselves, and the memory carried trauma as well as pride. They had hoped for freedom and received only survival. They had seen the worst of what human beings could do to each other, and no subsequent experience could quite erase that knowledge. The galley on which you fought was repaired and returned to service. The Christian slaves freed from Ottoman vessels were distributed among various cities and institutions. Many of them enlisted as rowers on Christian galleys, their slavery simply changing masters rather than ending. The rhythm of galley life resumed, the daily routine of rowing, eating, sleeping, the chains restored, the brief liberation of battle becoming a memory that grew distant and dreamlike. But something had changed, even if it was subtle, even if it affected more the realm of imagination than practical reality. The Ottoman fleet, rebuilt though it was, never quite recovered its aggressive confidence. Christian galleys patrolled more freely in waters that had been dangerous before. The balance had shifted incrementally but real. And in the broader sweep of history, Lepanto would mark a transition. The age of the galley was already beginning to wane. The future of naval warfare belonged to sailing ships, to vessels powered by wind rather than human muscle, to Atlantic powers like England and the Dutch Republic, rather than Mediterranean powers like Venice. Within a few generations, the galley would become an anachronism, a curiosity, a reminder of a different era. But in 1571, none of this was yet clear. In 1571, galleys still ruled the Mediterranean, and the men who rowed them, whether enslaved or free, Christian or Muslim, willing or coerced, were still the indispensable foundation of naval power. Let us leave the Battle of Lepanto now. Let the sounds of combat fade. Let the smoke clear and the water calm. We have witnessed the largest galley battle in history, seen how these vessels fought, understood the role that the rowers played in the violence. The memory of that October day will stay with us as we move forward in our journey, but now we turn our attention to a different kind of investigation, not the dramatic clash of fleets, but the patient work of archaeology, the study of galleys, not as they were experienced by the living, but as they have been discovered by the patient exploration of the sea's depths, where time and water have transformed ships and men into artifacts of a vanished world. And so we come to the end of our journey, through the world of the Celtic Druids, through the reality behind the romantic legends. We've walked the difficult path from youth to trained priest, spent decades memorizing knowledge that could never be written down. We've stood on the shore at Anglesey and watched the Roman legions cross the water, witnessed the destruction of the sacred centre and the scattering of the Druidic order. We've contemplated the mystery of the bog bodies, those preserved victims whose deaths speak to us across millennia, about practices we can document but never fully understand. And we've explored the sacred groves, the oak-shaded places where Druids held court, advised kings, and maintained the religious life of their people. What emerges from all of this is a picture very different from the mystical, peaceful Druids of popular imagination. These were complex figures operating in a brutal world, powerful but constrained, learned but bound by tradition, religious but also deeply political. They spent decades in training for roles that would demand they oversee human sacrifice, navigate dangerous tribal politics, maintain impossible standards of memory and performance, all while living in the harsh physical conditions of Iron Age Europe. Their world ended decisively, destroyed by Roman military power and cultural transformation. The sacred groves were cut down. The Druids themselves were killed or scattered. The oral tradition, dependent on unbroken transmission, was broken. Within a few generations, the living Druidic tradition had essentially vanished, leaving only fragments for later ages to puzzle over and often to romanticize beyond recognition. But for a time, in the oak groves of Britain and Gaul, the Druids held real power, shaped real lives, mediated between their people and the forces they believed governed existence. They were not the wise mystics of later legend, but they were something. Priests, judges, advisors, keepers of knowledge, performers of terrible rituals, they lived lives of discipline and duty, of influence and danger, of certainty in their traditions and perhaps private doubt about their meanings. And now they are gone, surviving only in archaeological traces, in the biased accounts of their enemies, in the bodies preserved in bogs, in the stumps of sacred oaks long since fallen. The silence that replaced their chanting is 2,000 years deep. As you drift towards sleep now, let go of the weight of this history. You live in a different world, where knowledge is written and preserved, where human sacrifice is universally condemned, where the old certainties of tribal life have been replaced by different structures and different uncertainties. The struggles of the Druids, their achievements and their failures, their power and their destruction, all of this is safely in the past, unable to touch you, relevant only as history, as story, as a window into human experience in a time before your own. Rest easy. The groves are silent, the rituals have ended, the long memorization is over, the final stand has been made and lost. The bodies rest in their bog water preservation, far from the lives they once lived. And the oak trees, the few that remain from those ancient times, stand in forests that no longer remember what they once witnessed, their roots reaching deep into earth that holds secrets it will never tell. Sleep now. The past cannot harm you. The Druids are long gone. Their world has passed away. And you remain here in the present, safe and still, with all the comfort of distance from those harsh, strange times when priests memorized empires' worth of knowledge, when human lives were offerings to unknown gods, when the sacred groves stood ancient and terrible beneath the northern sky. Let it all fade. History recedes. The present is all that matters. Sleep dreamlessly if possible, undisturbed by bog bodies or fallen groves, or the ghosts of priests whose names we'll never know. The story is complete. The telling is done. Rest now, and let the quiet darkness of simple sleep replace the dark complexity of vanished lives and forgotten sanctities. Good night.